Wow. Good morning.
Good morning.
On behalf of my pastor, Reverend Couture Pittman, I bring you greetings from Greater Hurst Chapel AME Church, a church that has developed a very trusting and loving relationship with this church, so I don't feel that I'm not at home today. It's a blessing when you can count your co-workers as family, and so to my Emma Booker family, I thank you all for being here with me today. And even one of my USF family members is here, Dave, so thank you. Glad to see you, see a familiar face. And to my number one cheerleader, my first teacher, I want to thank my mom for being here with me today as well. As much as I talk, you would think I would not be nervous, but when you have been, I call this Christian bullying, because I have been bullied, Christian bullied, by Letitia Williams. Which is why I stand here today. I did my best to ignore her every time she said something. She said, I need a date. It's like, yeah, the 32nd of February. That's what I'm coming. So I know Letitia was then bullied by Reverend Brock. So as you see, bullying is alive and well in the church. But I do thank you for the opportunity. I really do. To begin, I am not a preacher by any means. I am a teacher. I am a teacher through and through. So it is my prayer that you just hear what I have to say, the lesson that I have to give. And as I told Reverend Brock, I said, you know, Black history, people often say it should be taught in our schools. Well, yeah, it should be, but the first place you should learn it is at home. And if you can look up what Jennifer Aniston is doing, who's wearing what at the Oscars, you can look up your own history. Okay, you can look up anybody's history. If you want to know something, you know where to find it. So we're not going to blame the schools for not teaching it, but we need to reinforce it. But the first place you learn it is at home. So off that soapbox. But again, I am a teacher, so class is now in session. If there were ever to be a theme given to the experience of African Americans in America, I believe it would have to be Galatians chapter 6, verse 9. Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up. I have to believe that this scripture, as well as tons of prayers, led the ancestors to dream of freedoms, opportunities, and movements much larger than themselves. It is imperative that I believe that men and women were willing to risk life and limb to do just as Jesus did. Pay the price for all of us so that we can enjoy the lifestyles and daily routines we often take for granted. Now, before I begin, please allow me to remind you or inform you that Black history did not begin in the bowels of large ships populated by stolen Africans shackled and chained to one another, packed in like sardines as they made the tumultuous voyage to the New World. My history began with great kings and queens and scholars of great African civilizations. Amen. Now let's take a trip back in history to a time when two women who never tired of their well-doing. One who would use her voice and stature to speak as an abolitionist and as part of the women's movement, Isabella Baumfree, or you may know her as Sojourner Truth. Yes. Did you know that in 1926, while living in New York had begun discussing legislation to abolish slavery, although slavery did not end in New York until July 4th, 1827. And due to her master going back on his word to release her from his servitude, Isabella Baumfree escaped with her 5-year-old daughter. Later, due to a religious experience, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth, traveling and speaking on the ills of being enslaved. And although a part of the women's movement, she was not afraid to remind her audiences that Black women were not treated nor held in the same regard as white women. This is not an easy task, but Sojourner believed that God himself wanted her to speak the truth, and she did that, not concerned with death or any other consequences. Sojourner Truth knew that God would bless her in her well-doing. Harriet Tubman She refused to live as a slave forever. And when she reached Philadelphia and got a taste of freedom, she thought nothing of herself as she traveled back to Maryland to free hundreds of others. Never growing of slave catchers on her heels and dogs on her scent, Harriet never tarried in weariness. And one of the things from the movie, my favorite quote from the movie is when William Still says to her, you can't go back, and she says, you can't tell me what to do. And when you think about when God leads you to do something, and when God leads you, not when you lead yourself, but when God leads you to do something, and you have naysayers who will tell you, you can't do that, you're not good enough, you're not smart enough, you're not intelligent enough, you don't have the resource to do that. You just remind them that when God leads you, you can't tell me what to do. Amen. Fast forward to the 1950s, a young lawyer by the name of Thurgood Marshall began gathering information, evidence, and data to prove that separate but equal was not only unfair, but it was unconstitutional. And in 1954, the Supreme Court of the United States would deem separate but equal a way of the past. Thurgood Marshall would go from lawyer of the NAACP to becoming the first African-American Supreme Court justice. You will receive your harvest at the right time. Yes. And thanks to the Supreme Court's decision, Daisy Bates would organize the Little Rock Nine to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. These students would deal with mobs of angry white people who would do all that they could to block the students from entering the school, and upon entering, they faced verbal and physical abuse from their white peers, and parents even lost their jobs for allowing their children to be a part of the movement. No time to lean on weariness. In 1960, David Richmond, Franklin McCain, Ezell A. Blair, and Joseph McNeil, 4 students attending North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, would summon all the courage the Lord could give as they would pay the price to desegregate the lunch counters in North Carolina. They would sit still while having cigarette smoke blown in their faces, having insults hurled at them and food poured on them, all the while keeping their cool. These names may not sound familiar to you in the history books in which they do not exist. They are better known as the Greensboro Four. You can't tire when you're demanding equality. Yes. The Freedom Riders, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. These organizations with memberships of white and black comrades in the fight for justice came together during these times to tend to causes greater than themselves. But these were national stories, heroes and sheroes from other states, but the same fights and plights existed right here in our own backyard. Annually, our beaches draw thousands of visitors. As diverse as the sand may be on any given Suncoast beach, it was evident that one group of people were not invited, nor allowed to enjoy burying themselves in the sand, collecting shells, or being able to enjoy holding hands with friends while jumping waves. African Americans had to drive to an unofficial beach for blacks all the way down in Venice. And after much protest by the citizens of Newtown, blacks were permitted to swim at the rocky, jellyfish-infested beach of City Island. However, the protest continued, and it would take years of caravans and wade-ins before all of Sarasota's residents would be able to enjoy the top-rated beaches in the country. The protesters were bound to reap their harvest. Emma Edwina Booker was one of the first educators in the Newtown community. Yeah. She had no formal college education when she began teaching. Yes. Emma Booker was a true and real example of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 27 through 29. God doesn't call the qualified, he qualifies the chosen. And because of her untiring love and dedication to the children of the community, Today, her legacy stands in the form of 3 campuses. Ms. Booker had no idea how her sowing would yield such a large harvest that thousands and upon thousands of students would boast that they are proud graduates of Emma Booker's legacy. Before the schools of Sarasota County were officially integrated, Thomas Clyburn and Wilhelmina Armstrong were chosen to integrate Sarasota High School in 1963. There isn't much written about Wilhelmina's experience, but Thomas would spend his mornings at Sarasota High School and his afternoons at Booker High School. There was no National Guard to protect Clyburn as he walked the halls pretending to be deaf to the name-calling and throwing of objects at him. Thomas Clyburn's father had passed away. His mother was a hard worker. He had other siblings. And there was a meeting held with the principal of then Booker High School with some of the white school board members. His mother was never involved in any of these conversations for him to be chosen as one of those students who would be the first to integrate Sarasota High School. There was no Greensboro 4, there was no Little Rock 9. It was just Thomas and Wilhelmina. And he's not even sure that she went on to school because they never saw one another. But in his time there, he would be harassed and he would be bullied and names called. And one day he went to his class, his electronics class, and he went early to try to hide from the other students of the school. And as he was in class, he saw a young man walk by with a dog, a German Shepherd. And the young man went into another classroom and shot into the classroom where Thomas was. There's no record of this actually written anywhere because it wasn't reported, but it's Thomas's memory. And he was one child that would ride the bus. He rode the bus by himself from Booker High School to Sarasota High School. And he could never tell his mother about it because he didn't think she would understand. He didn't talk to the teachers at Sarasota High School because he didn't really think they cared. He became very close with his bus driver, Robert Graham, who would drive him back and forth. And they would have conversation about the experiences he was having at Sarasota High School. And one day they drove down to Venice Beach, and they just sat and they talked. And even though Mr. Graham did not have a formal education, he had the listening heart and ear to help Thomas get through those years at Sarasota High School. So he spent his time from 1963 to 1965 at Sarasota High School before any other schools were integrated in our community. In 1968, a young college graduate returned home from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University. She would submit an application at the Sarasota County School Board to be a teacher. When she didn't hear from the school board, she began submitting applications at various establishments, restaurants, stores, and at a local bank. She did finally receive a job offer from Palmer Bank, where she was the first Black hired to work inside of the bank. She wouldn't be seen by the public, however. She was housed on the second floor where she was responsible for dealing with returned checks. This job lasted only for 2 weeks as she finally received a job offer from the Sarasota County School Board. There would be several discussions about her certification from North Carolina A&T State University. As you know, that's an HBCU, a historically Black college and university. She was given a very hard time by the HR director, and after much discussion, she was offered a temporary contract and required to take an additional class. She would go on to spend the next 35 years teaching at Sarasota Junior High School and then Sarasota Middle School. She would retire and then go back to work for 13 more years to increase and enhance parental involvement in the Title I schools. She would produce 2 amazing daughters who would follow in her footsteps as teachers in the same district. She knew not to give up, and she didn't. Her name is Carolyn Yancey Major Harper. You see, the Booker schools were the only schools where Black children were allowed to attend. I remember stories from my mom telling me that they got the raggedy books from the other white schools and from the high schools where the pages may be torn out and books just were frayed. And in 1968, approximately 100 black students attended Sarasota High School. If you know anything about the history of Sarasota and Booker High School, during the 1966-67 school year, Booker High School had the baddest basketball team you ever knew in the state. They would play games where they would score over 100 points. They would outscore their opponents. And one player, he would score alone 50 points, just a regular. And so these students, finally, when they decided they were going to close the Booker School, there was a dividing line, and those of us that were here for the Newtown history a couple weeks ago, there was a dividing line, which was 27th Street, Martin Luther King. And if you lived on one side, you would go to Riverview. If you lived on the other side, you would go to Sarasota. And in the film Into the Storm, the players discussed how the coaches from both of the schools would come and they basically pick who they wanted to be their team, on their team. And knowing that they would be closing Booker High School, but no one else knew at that time. So these students were forced to attend Sarasota High School, and during those days, the cheerleaders were elected by the student body. Again, there was only about 100 black students who were there. So the black students were concerned that they would never have a cheerleader on the squad as they wouldn't have enough votes. The black student delegation met with the administration, and the policy was changed. Ironically, almost 20 plus years later, my sister and I would have cheerleading careers that spanned our entire 4 years while we were students at Sarasota High School. Now, I know this story because a very special person shared it with me, my uncle, Hugh Yancey Jr. He spent his senior year at Sarasota High School where he was a standout athlete. He has the designation of being the first African-American student to be drafted by the Major League Baseball from high school to play for the Chicago White Sox in 1968. Although his dream, as well as the other students who had to leave Booker, seemed to be taken from them, he had much to reap. He planted seeds to show other black students that the path might change, but you can still be successful. When you do good towards others, it should never be for the purpose of receiving accolades and recognition. We do good because God commands us to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. Amen. Look at the sacrifices made by so many others in history, nationally and locally. They didn't do good to invite threats and have taunting and blatant and passive racism and the inability to acquire housing or maintain jobs when they were trying to make the world a better place for you and me. They did what they did, maybe not even cognizantly, but because they wanted to be treated fairly. They wanted to change conditions, mindsets, and hearts. They wanted to change the world. Perhaps they saw their harvest and were able to actually reap it. But I leave this question with you. What has God chosen you to do? What battle or project or fight is God qualifying you to triumph and make a difference? Are you listening, or are you expecting the person beside you to do it instead? You may feel that you don't have the tools, the knowledge, or the wherewithal to make a difference. But each of us has the responsibility to love each other as God has loved us. That means not sitting around and seeing others suffer, not turning a blind eye to the wrongs of the world. Yes. Jeremiah 29:11 says, For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Listen to God's word, heed the call, and be ready to do his work, and never grow weary in doing good. Thank you. Amen.